I'm on my way to see a strange geological spectacle that could help track down the events behind the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. On the east coast of the Dead Sea is this incredible pillar of rock, a source of imagination and intrigue for centuries. It's known as Lot's wife.
What if one glance could freeze you for eternity? Near the Dead Sea stands a pillar of salt, said to be Lot's wife. But recent discoveries suggest there's more than legend here. Pottery fused into glass, bones scattered as if by instant fire, soil so salty nothing grew for centuries. Evidence of a disaster that science can barely explain. Divine punishment, natural catastrophe, or a secret buried for thousands of years, waiting to rewrite history? Tonight, we go to the desert to uncover the truth. And what we find might change everything you thought you knew. Desert of Judgment. The story is in Genesis 19. And even if you've never opened a Bible in your life, you probably know the outline. Two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, had become so wicked that God decided to destroy them.
The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were full of evil, licentiousness, rampant with murder, and indulgence in extravagant pleasures. Sodom, Gomorrah, and all their residents were reduced to ashes, disappearing into the wrath of God.
Before the destruction, two angels arrived in Sodom, disguised as travelers. They came to the house of Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot took them in. That night, the men of the city surrounded Lot's house and demanded he hand over his guests. Lot refused. The angels struck the mob blind, and then they delivered a warning that would change everything. Get out, take your wife, take your daughters, leave this city and don't stop running. And whatever you do and whatever happens behind you, do not look back. Think about what that must have felt like. You're being told that everything you've known, your home, your neighbors, the streets you walked every day, is about to be erased. And you're not allowed to watch it happen. You just have to run and trust that the voice telling you to run knows what it's doing. Lot hesitated. The text says he lingered. The angels had to physically grab him and his family by the hands and pull them out of the city. That detail always strikes me because it's so profoundly human. Even when destruction is certain, we hesitate. We cling. We can't quite let go of the life we know, and even when staying means dying. They ran toward a small town called Zoar, and then the sky opened. Genesis describes it as brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The cities were overthrown. The plain was destroyed. Everything that grew from the ground was consumed. And somewhere on that road to Zoar, with the heat at her back, the sound of a civilization being unmade, Lot's wife stopped, and she turned around. The text doesn't say why. It doesn't give her an interior monologue. It doesn't explain whether she was curious, or terrified, or heartbroken. It just says she looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. That's it. One verse, Genesis 19:26. One of the shortest and most devastating sentences in the entire Bible. And it has haunted readers for 3,000 years. Jesus himself referenced it centuries later in Luke 17:32, with just 3 words that carry the weight of the entire story. Remember Lot's wife. He said it as a warning about the coming judgment, about what happens when you can't let go of what's behind you. He didn't need to retell the story. Everyone already knew it. That's how deep this one goes. But here's what the text doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you her name. In the entire Bible, she is never named. She is identified only by her relationship to Lot. A woman who lived, who raised daughters, who built a life in a city, and who is remembered only for a single moment, a single glance. That absence of a name has bothered people for millennia. In the Midrash, the Jewish tradition of biblical commentary, rabbis gave her the name Ado, or Edith, or Idit. They couldn't accept that a person this significant could go unnamed. They felt what we feel, that the silence around her identity is itself a kind of mystery. And across cultures, the story echoed. The ancient Greeks had Orpheus, who lost Eurydice by looking back as he led her out of the underworld. Different mythology, same devastating structure. The backward glance that costs everything. Something about this pattern is hardwired into us. The idea that there are moments when you must only look forward, and that the penalty for turning around is absolute. It appears in stories separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, as if every civilization, independently, had arrived at the same terrible truth. But what makes the story of Lot's wife different, what makes it sharper than all the parallels, is the landscape. Because unlike Orpheus and Eurydice, this story has an address. It has coordinates. You can go there. You can stand where it supposedly happened. And when you do, you'll find something waiting for you in the salt. The Dead Sea and the Pillar of Salt. If you've never stood on the shore of the Dead Sea, I want to take you there. Not the tourist version, not the spa brochure with people floating and smiling with mud on their faces. The real place, the ancient place, the one that made people believe God had passed through and left his fingerprints in the rock. You're standing at the lowest exposed point on Earth's surface, roughly 430 meters below sea level. The air is different here, heavier, thicker. It has more oxygen per breath than anywhere else on the planet because of the atmospheric pressure at this depth.
So salty that no fish or plants live in its mineral-rich waters. Some 1,300 feet below sea level, it is the lowest surface on Earth.
Your lungs feel it. Your skin feels it. And in front of you stretches a body of water so alien that the Romans didn't even call it a sea. They called it Lake Asphaltites, because chunks of natural bitumen, black and shining, would periodically float to the surface like something the earth was coughing up. The water itself is almost 10 times saltier than the ocean. About 34% mineral content. Nothing survives in it. No fish, no plant life, and no microorganisms that we can see with the naked eye. The shoreline is encrusted white, layers of salt, potassium chloride, magnesium, and bromide deposited over thousands of years of evaporation. In some places, the salt formations along the beach look like coral. In others, they look like bones. And there's a smell, faint but persistent, sulfur, seeping up through the ground from natural deposits below. And this is a landscape that smells like something burned a long time ago and never fully healed. Now here's something most people don't realize. The Dead Sea is dying. It's been shrinking for decades. The Jordan River, which once fed it, has been diverted for agriculture and drinking water by Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. The sea level drops roughly 1 meter per year, and as it recedes, it leaves behind something disturbing: sinkholes. More than 6,000 of them have opened along the shoreline since the 1980s. The ground simply collapses, swallowing roads, buildings, date palm groves. In some areas, entire sections of beach have fallen into underground cavities dissolved by freshwater meeting ancient salt deposits. The land is literally swallowing itself. If you wanted a place that feels cursed, that feels like the aftermath of divine judgment, you couldn't design one better than this. Now turn your eyes south. And on the southwestern shore rises a formation called Har Sodom, Mount Sodom. And this mountain is not like other mountains. It's not granite. It's not limestone. It's made almost entirely of halite, the mineral form of sodium chloride. Rock salt, hundreds of meters of it pushed upward by tectonic pressure from deep beneath the Rift Valley floor. And Mount Sodom is alive, not biologically, geologically. Rainfall dissolves its surface, wind sculpts new channels. Our old columns collapse while new ones emerge. The mountain is in a constant state of transformation, reshaping itself decade by decade, century by century. Among these formations, scattered along its ridges and slopes, there are pillars, salt columns rising from the landscape like standing figures, narrow at the top, broader at the base, pale and silent against the desert sky. Some of them, if you let your imagination work even slightly, look human. One pillar in particular has carried a name for longer than most nations have existed: Lot's wife. Local Bedouin guides have pointed to it for generations. Pilgrims have journeyed to see it for centuries. And the identification isn't modern. It isn't a tourism board invention. Flavius Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian writing around 75 AD, claimed he saw this pillar with his own eyes. In his Antiquities of the Jews, he recorded that the salt formation associated with Lot's wife remained visible in his time. Now, Josephus wasn't always a careful historian. He had political motivations. He was writing to impress Roman patrons. But his testimony establishes something important. The link between this landscape and the Genesis account is at least 2,000 years old. He wasn't the only one. Early Christian pilgrims traveling through the region in the 4th and 5th centuries also described seeing the pillar. Their accounts vary. Some said it was tall, others described it as partially eroded, a few claimed it had been miraculously restored. That inconsistency actually makes perfect geological sense. Salt formations on Mount Sodom don't last forever. They dissolve in rain, fracture in heat, and reform through ongoing tectonic pressure. But the pillar Josephus saw in the 1st century is almost certainly not the same formation that stands there today. The mountain keeps producing new ones, new shapes, new figures that look just human enough to carry the old story forward into the next generation. Is a naturally occurring salt pillar the literal physical body of a woman transformed by God's judgment? That's a question faith answers, not science. Geology can explain the mechanics, the dissolution cycles, the tectonic uplift, and the mineral chemistry of the Dead Sea Rift. It can tell you how salt pillars form and how long they last. What it cannot tell you is whether one particular moment of formation was natural or something else entirely. That question exists outside the jurisdiction of any laboratory. But here's what the science can tell us. Something catastrophic happened in this region. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. Something that scorched the earth, salted the soil, and left scars so deep that the ground still hasn't recovered. And in the last 2 decades, archaeologists have started pulling those scars out of the dirt. What they found made the whole world pay attention. Skyborne city destruction. Let's talk about Tall el-Hammam. It's an archaeological site in the southern Jordan Valley, northeast of the Dead Sea.
Dr. Stephen Collins, director of the excavation of Tall el-Hammam, Jordan, and it's a special site, and we're on location here at a very important part of the site.
It's been excavated systematically since 2005, and then what researchers have found there has generated headlines around the world and a significant amount of controversy. Tall el-Hammam was a major Bronze Age city. At its peak, it was one of the largest settlements in the region, possibly 10 times the size of Jerusalem at the same period. It had massive fortification walls, monumental architecture, a thriving population. And then, around 1650 BCE, give or take a few decades, it was destroyed. Violently. Suddenly. And in a way that the excavation team says they had never seen before at any other site. Here's what they found in the destruction layer. Pottery that had been heated to temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt the surface into glass. Mud brick walls that had been turned to calcium powder on one side but remained intact on the other, suggesting an intense directional blast. Microscopic spherules of melted minerals embedded in the soil. Shocked quartz, a mineral deformation that typically occurs only under extreme pressure, like that produced by nuclear explosions or asteroid impacts. And a layer of salt, unusually high concentrations of salt in the destruction matrix, consistent with superheated material being blasted from the Dead Sea. In 2021, a team of more than 20 scientists published a peer-reviewed paper in the journal Scientific Reports, proposing that Tal el-Hammam was destroyed by a cosmic airburst, an asteroid or comet fragment that exploded in the atmosphere above the city. They compared the evidence to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, where an airburst flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest without leaving an impact crater. Let me give you a sense of scale on Tunguska, because it matters. In June of 1908, a fireball exploded over a remote Siberian forest with the energy of roughly 12 megatons of TNT, about 800 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. It knocked down an estimated 80 million trees. It generated a shock wave that registered on seismic instruments in England, and it didn't even hit the ground. It exploded in the air. That's what an airburst does. It detonates before impact, and the thermal pulse and pressure wave do the damage. If something similar happened over a populated Bronze Age city, even something smaller, the results would have been annihilation. The temperatures generated by such an event would have been sufficient to produce every type of damage observed at the site. The shock wave would have been powerful enough to shear off the upper portions of buildings, and the extreme heat, briefly exceeding the surface temperature of the sun, would explain the glassified pottery, the melted minerals, and the devastation of the agricultural land that made the area uninhabitable for centuries afterward. Now, I need to be very clear about something. This is a scientific hypothesis. It is not universally accepted. Other archaeologists have challenged the airburst interpretation. Some argue the destruction could be explained by earthquake activity. The Dead Sea sits on a major fault line. Others point out that dating the destruction to a specific century is difficult with the available methods, and the question of whether Tal el-Hammam is actually the biblical Sodom is itself a matter of intense debate.
Here in Jordan, Tal el-Hammam is likely the site of biblical Sodom that everyone's so familiar with. Right now I'm located on the part of Hammam.
Many scholars place Sodom elsewhere, or consider it a purely literary creation. But here's what's undeniable. Something destroyed this city. Something that left a destruction signature that the excavation team says is unlike anything produced by warfare, earthquake, or conventional volcanic activity in the known archaeological record of the region. Whether you call it an act of God or an act of physics, or both, the ground tells a story of sudden, overwhelming annihilation. And the salt. There's always the salt. The destruction layer at Tal el-Hammam contains unusually high levels of it. Researchers have suggested that a high-energy airburst over the Dead Sea could have vaporized enormous quantities of salt water and deposited it across the landscape, rendering the soil infertile. Genesis describes the aftermath in strikingly similar terms. The land was overthrown, nothing could grow, and the area became a desolation. For people living in the region centuries later, people who could see the barren, salt-crusted wasteland and the strange formations on Mount Sodom. The story of divine fire and a woman turned to salt wouldn't have seemed like fantasy. It would have seemed like an explanation. That's an important distinction. I'm not saying science proves the Bible. I'm not saying archaeology has confirmed Genesis 19 as a literal news report. What I'm saying is that the physical evidence and the ancient text seem to be describing the same kind of event from different frameworks. One uses the language of faith, the other uses the language of physics, and they converge in a landscape that still bears the scars. Gaze that freezes. Let's come back to the woman. The unnamed woman on the road to Zoar. Yeah, because whatever you believe about the archaeology or the airburst or the salt, the real power of this story has never been about geology. It's been about that single, devastating human moment. The moment she turned around. Why did she look back? The Bible doesn't say. And that silence has created one of the richest spaces for interpretation in all of Scripture. For thousands of years, readers have tried to fill that gap. and what they've filled it with says as much about them as it does about her. Some traditions say she looked back out of disobedience, a failure to trust God's command. In this reading, the glance is a test of faith, and she failed. The punishment is proportional to the transgression. She was told to look forward, and she chose to look back. The salt pillar becomes a monument to the cost of disobedience. But other readings are more compassionate. Some rabbinical commentaries suggest she looked back because her married daughters were still in Sodom. They hadn't left. They hadn't believed the warning. And what mother, hearing the world collapse behind her, could keep walking without turning to see if her children were alive? In this reading, the glance isn't rebellion. It's love. The most painful kind of love. The kind that can't save the people it refuses to abandon. There's a third interpretation that I find particularly haunting. And some scholars read the backward glance as attachment, not to people, but to a way of life. Sodom, in the biblical narrative, represents comfort, wealth, indulgence. Lot's wife had built a life there. She had a home, a social position, a daily existence. When the angels said run, they weren't just asking her to leave a city. They were asking her to leave everything she knew, everything she'd built, every familiar thing. And she couldn't do it. Not completely. Something in her was still tied to what was burning. And that tie, that inability to fully release the past, is what destroyed her. If that doesn't hit you where you live, think about it for a second longer. How many of us are walking forward while looking back? How many of us are carrying attachments to things that are already gone? Relationships that ended, versions of ourselves that no longer exist, places we've outgrown, habits we know are destroying us. We know we need to keep moving. And we know the fire is behind us. And still, something in us turns. Something whispers. Just one more look. Just one more moment. That's why this story has survived for 3,000 years. Not because of the salt, not because of the archaeology, because of the recognition. Because every person who has ever tried to leave something behind and felt the pull to go back, every person who has stood at the threshold of a new life and hesitated, sees themselves in that unnamed woman on the road. And maybe that's why she's unnamed, not as an insult, not as erasure, but because she could be anyone. She could be you. She could be me. The anonymity isn't a flaw in the narrative. It's the point. Her story is universal precisely because she has no name. She is every person who has ever been caught between what was and what could be, and who turned back at the worst possible moment. Jesus understood this. When he said, "Remember Lot's wife," he wasn't giving a history lesson. He was giving a warning that transcends time. He was saying, when the moment comes to move forward, when the fire is falling and the door is closing, don't hesitate, don't linger. Don't let the pull of what you're losing override the urgency of what you're gaining. Because the backward glance costs more than you think. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. We live in an age of constant nostalgia. We scroll through old photos, we replay old conversations, we romanticize past versions of our lives that, if we're honest, weren't that great while we were living them. And there's nothing wrong with memory. Memory is beautiful, memory is necessary. But there's a difference between remembering and returning, between honoring where you've been and being unable to leave it. Lot's wife didn't sin by having feelings about Sodom. She was human. Of course she had feelings. But in the moment when everything depended on forward motion, in the moment when the fire was literally at her back, the pull of the past was stronger than the promise of the future, and it froze her. I think that's why this story has been told in churches, synagogues, mosques, and living rooms for 3,000 years. Not because people need a geology lesson, because people need to hear that the backward glance is dangerous. That letting go is hard and holy, and sometimes the only way to survive. The pillar still stands, silent, frozen, watching, and the desert keeps its secrets close. We've traced the fire, measured the salt, followed the footprints of history, but the full story is far from revealed. So I leave you with this. If one glance could change everything, what would you risk turning back to see? The answer is out there, buried in the sand, waiting for someone brave enough to look.